Welcome, everyone. I am Lynn Feynman, a member of community engagement and the Jewish Theological Seminary. We thank you for joining us for this session with Dr. Michal Raucher from Justification to Justice, Jewish Sources on Abortion. Before I introduce Dr. Raucher, I just wanted to go over a few quick logistical announcements. As I just said, we will all remain muted, and we will have a couple of question and answer periods during this hour. We will do that by sending a chat to me, or you may use the raise hand feature, and we will unmute you if we will be taking your question. We would like to focus on questions rather than comments or personal stories. We will be posting the sessions, the sources into the chat, and I will also provide a link to a sheet where you can download that material yourself. Michal Raucher is an associate professor of Jewish studies at Rutgers University and a JTS fellow. Her research lies at the intersection of the anthropology of women in Judaism, reproductive ethics, and religious authority. As a Fulbright Fellow, Dr. Raucher conducted research on the reproductive ethics of Haredi, that is ultra-Orthodox Jewish women in Israel. Her first book, which is based on this research, is titled Conceiving Agency, Reproductive Authority Among Haredi Women. So thank you again for being here. And Dr. Raucher, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Great, thank you, Lynn. Can everybody hear me? Wonderful. Okay, so it's great to see you all tonight. This topic, as you know, is kind of always relevant, but especially relevant now, given everything that's going on. Those of you who are local to Maryland and DC might be going to the Jewish Rally for Abortion Justice on Tuesday. If you don't know about it and you want to go, you can Google Jewish Rally for Abortion Justice. I'm really honored to be teaching about this topic. It not only relates to my, previous research on reproduction among Jewish women, ultra-Orthodox women. It also relates to some new research that I've been doing for the last year with a team of researchers from around the country. We are interviewing religious women who've had abortions recently, and this research is going to become even more pressing in the coming weeks and months. So I'm excited to share these thoughts with you today and these sources. What we're going to do today is, as goes with the theme of the evening, we're going to be expanding the canon regarding, or I'm going to suggest that we should expand the canon in terms of the sources that we think about when we want to think about Jewish perspectives on abortion, in particular Jewish perspectives that are supportive of abortion access and abortion justice. What I need to do first, though, is kind of give folks, if you don't already know, or maybe you need a refresher, a little bit of a lay of the land of what the current sources are that we tend to use. And when I say we, I mean conservative Jews, but it could be expanded to liberal Jews. It could even encompass many Orthodox Jews that liberal Jews use in order to support abortion access. There is a kind of a canon of sources that Jewish institutions, Jewish leaders, many Jewish voices have used in order to support abortion, in order to support their support of abortion access. So I'm going to give a little overview of those sources. This is not an exhaustive list, but it is certainly some of the foundational texts that have been used. I'll show you how they're being used by some conservative leaders, how they've been used for the last several decades. And you'll see that the biblical sources are being used strategically and in order to further a particular end. But you should know that the biblical and rabbinic sources that I'm going to show tonight in terms of the canon sources are not the only things that are informing these religious leaders' perspectives on abortion. They are also very much informed by the larger American context, by the religious right, which is very much who they are responding to or in conversation with, depending on who we're talking about. And so the sources are not at any given time the only thing that are informing folks' opinions on abortion, even when they're trying to come up with an opinion that is supportive or in opposition to abortion. So, but nonetheless, I'm going to introduce you to some of the canonical sources. We'll see that these sources promote what's called, they are intending to be used in order to be supportive of abortion. And yet, what they are actually doing is promoting what's called a justification framework. A justification framework is one in which abortion is permissible only under certain circumstances. In other words, it requires one justify their abortion, and that certain justifications in this framework are acceptable and others are not. So you might be familiar, for example, with what we in reproductive rights refer to as prim abortions, PRIM, that's prenatal health, rape, incest, and maternal health. That those are the four situations, the four justifications that satisfy folks who are looking for morally acceptable abortions or legally acceptable abortions. We often talk about those prim reasons as good enough reasons for abortion. The problem with the justification framework that I will lay out here, that I'll show you how it lays out in our Jewish sources as well, is that it starts from the assumption that abortion is wrong and can only be permissible, either morally or legally, under certain circumstances. So that's kind of thing one that we're going to see is an assumption of our Jewish text as well. And that I think is a problem. The next thing that we're going to see in the sources is that, and this you'll see in the entirety of the sources we look at tonight, is that most abortions that are performed in America don't actually fall into those prim abortions, those abortions that are considered quote unquote justified. And you'll see that in the later sources as well. So the question kind of remains, is the justification approach really satisfying the need to present a pro-abortion or a position that is supportive of abortion? So that's problem number two that we'll see with the justification approach. And the third problem that we'll see with the justification approach is that it's not actually pro-choice. That Jewish leaders that are trying to portray Judaism as pro-choice while using a justification framework are actually undermining their goals. They are saying the opposite of a woman's right to choose. They are actually saying, well, it depends on the circumstances whether she can choose an abortion. And that's, to my mind, the opposite of pro-choice. So we'll see how the sources are, within that justification framework. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to try to run through those sources and give just a sampling, really, of those sources. You will have at your disposal, and I encourage you to look at them on your own, many more sources than what we're going to be able to get through. But that's kind of the first one. This is the justification approach that is most prominent among Jewish leaders and institutions today when it comes to advocating for abortion rights, abortion justice. Okay, but then we're going to switch to thinking about what an alternative canon of sources could be for those who are wanting to advocate for abortion rights. And what I'm going to show you is a large sampling of Jews who've had abortions and the way that they think about their abortions in a Jewish framework and in a personal framework. And what I'm going to say is that is a more justice-oriented approach to Jews advocating for abortion rights and abortion justice. And what we're going to see is that people have abortions for all sorts of different reasons. Most of them, or many of them, do not fit within those the justifications that our Jewish sources have laid out. And moreover, that there is a great deal of shame and confusion and secrecy among Jews who have abortions, because the justification approach is what's so prominent in the Jewish rhetoric around abortions. So that's what we're going to do tonight. That's a kind of big map of the evening. And I wanted to make sure I kind of gave you the conclusion before we even started, because as these sessions go, we always run out of time, but I wanted you to know where we were going so that if we didn't actually totally get there, you would still have a kind of a map for the evening. Okay, so now I'm going to start sharing my screen, and we will pause for questions very briefly after I introduce the canon, and then hopefully we'll leave more time for the justification, for the justice approach, for the different approach. Okay. Let's share my screen. Here we go. Okay, give me a thumbs up if you see those sources or that source sheet. Great, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Okay, and if you have any questions during the session, feel free to chat with Lynn. And then when I pause, we can raise hands and get there. Okay, so we're gonna start. I want to start just by showing you a couple of sources from the late 1970s, early 1980s. Some of the context here is that the Women's League for Conservative Judaism, which we will get to at the very end, was trying to put forward a resolution that was very supportive of reproductive rights and really pointedly supporting a woman's right to choose. And various prominent American conservative rabbis said no. They said that is not the Jewish perspective on abortion, actually. Now, remember, this is several years after Roe v. Wade, but this is very heavily into the period where the religious right was really growing powerfully as a movement and establishing religion as that which is anti-abortion. So just to give you a brief overview of these sources, you have Robert Gordis, who was a leading American Jewish rabbi and taught at JTS for many decades, saying, he wrote in this book, which was very popular at the time, abortion should be, quote, legally available but ethically restricted. Though the abortion of a fetus is not equivalent to taking an actual life, it does represent the destruction of potential life and must not be undertaken lightly. So this framework of legally available but ethically restricted was code for many years within the conservative movement for, we support Roe v. Wade and the passage of abortion rights, but really the ethically restricted belongs to religion. Religion should determine when abortion is really permissible and when it's not. And he's already setting up a framework here where he imagines, and this was very popular at the time, and it still is very popular, a subset of individuals who undertook abortion lightly, who saw it as kind of no big deal. This is just a stereotype about individuals who have abortions. And you'll see it pop up a little bit later as well, actually much more recently. Gershon Cohen, who was the chancellor of JTS in the 70s and the 80s, addresses Women's League in 1980, really saying that we stand for things that the moral majority stands for. This was a time when the conservative movement and the Orthodox movement also actually were aligning themselves with the moral majority on this issue in particular. So then we jump forward several decades, and this is the CJLS resolution on reproductive freedom. This should not say CC, it should say the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. That's the conservative movement's legal arm. They wrote a resolution on reproductive freedom in 2007, where they say Judaism does not believe that personhood and human rights begin with conception. We'll get to that source that establishes that in a few moments, but with birth. So, okay, human life does not begin with conception, but with birth. Again, Jewish law does not condone or permit abortion for contraceptive purposes. This is again a kind of reference to people who are having abortions instead of using contraception, or again, it's meant to kind of signal these individuals who are using it all, who are having constant abortions, but where the life or health of the mother are in jeopardy. So here they've set up the justification. What is the condition under which one could have an abortion? When the life or health of the mother are in jeopardy. Whereas the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards has affirmed the right of a woman to choose an abortion. So she has a right to choose an abortion in cases where, and then they quote a line that's been used in several resolutions prior, the continuation of a pregnancy might cause the mother severe physical or psychological harm, or where the fetus is judged by competent medical opinions as severely defective. So here they've set up a woman's right to choose in certain circumstances. Right? Does everybody see that? I'm like, nod if we're seeing that at least. Okay, great. I thrive off of response. So just nod if you're with me. Okay, great. Okay. So then I'm going to go even more recently. Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who has been a professor and rector at American Jewish University for very long, at Ziegler School on the West Coast. He wrote recently in a chapter of a book on religious approaches to abortion that the conservative movement sees the fetus as simply liquid during the first 40 days of gestation and like the thigh of its mother from then until birth. So he's referencing some other biblical rabbinic sources that I'm not going to get to, but in a more thorough class on these sources I would. So he says, so the fetus is simply liquid. In other words, he's saying it doesn't have the value of an independent human being. As a result, however, because it's like the thigh of its mother, the conservative movement forbids abortion as an act of self-injury. But when the woman's life or physical or mental health is at stake, an abortion may be required or permitted depending on the circumstances. And he says now that we can get fetal diagnoses, if abortions are also permitted if the fetus has a lethal or debilitating disease. Okay. So again, he's giving these justifications, these conditions under which abortion would be permissible. But then he wants to emphasize at the very end, non-Orthodox Jews, however, commonly misunderstand the tradition to permit abortion whenever the mother wants one. Again, this kind of sense that there are people just having abortions all the time, leading to far too many abortions among Jews, especially in light of the demographic crisis in which Jews currently find themselves, connecting therefore, or in some ways, blaming people who have abortions for the low reproductive rates among Jews. And I have given another class to this, to the Maryland group about pronatalism, but, and the demographic crisis. So what we see here is that in these more contemporary statements, there is this understanding that there are certain conditions under which abortion is permissible and certain conditions under which it isn't. So no abortions are not permissible, despite the fact that the fetus is not considered a person, that it doesn't have full value of life, as they all say, it's potential life and not full life. Even though that is the case, still, abortions should not be used for somebody taking this lightly. They should not be used for contraceptive purposes. They can be allowed, however, if the life of the mother is at risk, if there is a risk of psychological harm, or in the case of fetal diagnosis. This sounds actually like these prim reasons, but it doesn't include rape and incest in here. There's very little mention of rape and incest in statements from the conservative movement. Okay. Let's go to some of the sources that are undergirding these positions on abortion from the conservative movement. And I'm going to bring in 3 or 4 biblical rabbinic sources just to highlight this. So the first is from the book of Shemot, which forms really the foundation for the Jewish view that the fetus is not a person. So you might be familiar with this famous story When men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact from him, the payment to be based on reckoning. But if other damage ensues, which the rabbis understand to be, if the pregnant woman dies as a result of this altercation, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, etc., etc. In other words, this source is used among folks who are supportive of abortion for centuries thereafter to argue that the fetus does not have the same status as a full human person, or otherwise, when the miscarriage happened, there would have been also life for life, eye for eye. But since there's just a fine, the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Gemara and all the medieval commentaries all understand this source to be saying, no, the fetus is like property and not like human life. And this allows all of these later sources, the contemporary ones from that first page, to say the fetus is not human life. It is not equivalent to the mother's life. The mother is worth more than the fetus. Okay, so that's our kind of very introductory canon source. Great. Okay. You'll see this source references this Mishnah Ohalot source. So I'm going to go to the Mishnah Ohalot source. I'll skip that for now. But the next primary source that folks are using in order to create a Jewish support for abortion access is this one in the Mishnah. If a woman is having trouble giving birth, they cut up the child in her womb and bring it forth limb by limb, because her life comes before the life of the child. But if the greater part has come out, which many later commentaries understand to mean if its head has emerged, one may not touch it, for one may not set aside one person's life for that of another. So this source puts an endpoint on where does fetal life actually begin? Where does the fetus become a person? And the answer that this source gives is as soon as its head has emerged from the birthing canal. That's when it cannot be set aside. It cannot be killed in order to save the mother. So this source allows many later Jewish individuals who are supportive of abortion access to say, see, Jewish sources don't see life as starting until birth. Remember that source from the first page. Okay. Then things start changing a little bit with some later rabbinic sources. And I'm not going to read this whole thing, but this source in Sanhedrin in the Talmud refers to the case of a rodef. A rodef is a legal category, a Jewish legal category of someone who is a pursuer, someone who has come to kill you with intent to kill you. And the law says that if somebody is coming at you with intent to kill you, you are obligated and you're permitted or obligated to kill that person because out of self-defense. And this source here says, even if there's a minor, somebody who is not actually bound by halacha, bound by Jewish law, is coming to kill you, if they are in that category of rodef, can you kill them? And the Gemara says, yes, you can. But then Rav Chisda raises a question. And here I'm looking over here where it says, Rav Chisda raised an objection to Rav Huna from a Baraita. And they're going to refer back to that Mishnah we just looked at. If a woman was giving birth and her life was being endangered by the fetus, the life of the fetus may be sacrificed in order to save the mother. But once his head has emerged during the birthing process, he may not be harmed in order to save the mother because one life may not be pushed aside to save another life. In other words, Rav Chisda is asking, if one is permitted to save the pursued party, if one is permitted to save the pursued party by killing the minor, who is pursuing him? Why is this so? Isn't the fetus a pursuer who's endangering his mother's life? In other words, doesn't the fetus get counted as a rodef in this situation, even if it started to emerge from the birthing canal? And the Gemara says, no, we don't consider the fetus to be a rodef because the fetus has no free will. It is just an act of God. It is just, she's being pursued by heaven, the Gemara says. So the Gemara says, don't think about the fetus as a rodef. That's not the category that we're going to think of here. Leave that example aside. Okay, fine. So we don't have to think about the fetus as a rodef. That's irrelevant, except that several generations later, and here this source proves extremely influential in this conversation, so I'll kind of pause and read it slowly. Maimonides says, no, the fetus is a pursuer. This indeed is one of the negative mitzvot, one of the negative commandments, not to take pity on the life of the rodef, of the pursuer. On this basis, our sages ruled that when complications arise and a pregnant woman cannot give birth, it is permitted to abort the fetus in her womb, whether with a knife or with drugs. Now, just as an aside, Maimonides was also a doctor. Many of you might know that. So he's introducing to us a different way of multiple ways of performing abortions, which we know abortions have been performed since the beginning of time. So this is very interesting, but nonetheless, he is referring, he says in this discussion of the rodef, his example is the fetus. The fetus is a rodef, for the fetus is considered a rodef of its mother. If the head of the fetus emerges, it should not be touched, because then one life should not be sacrificed for another. Now, Maimonides changes the game for many later rabbinic authorities who see Maimonides as the authority on this here, not only because he's one of the later ones, but he's also, considered very brilliant, and he's a doctor. So on this issue, he's very insightful, they think. Many come to see that Maimonides is saying not just that abortion is permissible if the fetus is a rodef, but rather that abortion is only permissible if the fetus is a rodef. That Maimonides sets it up so that the fetus has to be threatening a mother's life, coming at her to kill her, in order for abortion to be justified. And many later rabbinic authorities, including those ones we see on that first page, are reading that as well, reading that in the same way. Now, they've expanded the category of maternal life and health so that some may say, well, if there's a threat to her regular life function, or a concern about her mental health as well, or her physical health, they might say. But they still require there to be some kind of justification for abortion that is based on a threat to the mother's health, because of this particular reading that Maimonides had that is clearly not in concert with the prior sources, but nonetheless is the one that is standing. So, okay, that is the end of our canon. That is our very brief introduction to those canonical sources on Jewish support for abortion. So I'm happy to take a few minutes of questions right now, maybe 3 minutes of questions, Lynn. Are there some in the chat already?
I did. I received one question by chat, and the question is, how broadly is the term mental health or mental state of the mother interpreted?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's hard to say because it is used vaguely. There are cases that I could think of that are for mental health that surely are not within the framework of our thinkers on that first page. I think what they have in mind, although it's hard to press them on this because it's used in such a broad way or a vague way, I think what they have in mind is severe postpartum depression. But I can't be sure because it's used in such a vague way. There have been, I'll say this, there over the years, particularly in the last several decades, there have been prominent Orthodox rabbis who have ruled on this and said, actually there was one from a couple centuries ago who said, if the mother would suffer, if the pregnancy is the result of an adulterous relationship and the mother would suffer shame as a result of continuing this pregnancy, then she should terminate the pregnancy. There are others, although I think it is more often used in the case that kind of Elliot Dorff describes in that first page as if there is a serious fetal diagnosis that would be very traumatic for parents to birth a baby that would die very soon after. So Eliezer Waldenberg was a prominent Israeli rabbi in the 1970s, ruled that in the case of a fetus diagnosed with Tay-Sachs, that an abortion would be permissible in that case. So I think that's kind of what they have in mind, but certainly not lesser things of mental health, lesser concerns of mental health.
Thank you very much. I have not received any other questions in the chat. If people do want to submit questions for Dr. Raucher, they can send chat to me. Perhaps we may not want to take too much. I don't see any hands raised using the raise hand feature, but
Okay.
I am not seeing the gallery view. So if you see a person who appears to be interested in asking a question, we could unmute them and have them ask their question, or you could return to teaching.
It looks quiet now. I'm happy to return, and then if folks have questions at the end, we can have some discussion at the end. That's fine. Okay,
Great.
Thanks, Lynn. Okay. Okay, so now I want to move on to this expansion of the canon. And for this expansion of the canon, I want to listen to this source number 10, Rabbi Emily Langowitz, Rabbi Joshua Fixler, who wrote a chapter in the recently released Social Justice Torah commentary on abortion and reproductive justice, responding explicitly to these sources that we use so commonly in the abortion, in pro-choice Jewish rhetoric on abortion. So they say these texts and their subsequent interpretations are a vital resource for all of us who seek to affirm Jewish support for the choice to terminate a pregnancy and to advocate from a Jewish perspective for laws that protect reproductive choice. And we are called to go further, they say. The law is only one facet of a full and holistic justice. The text in Exodus 21, that's that fight breaks out, miscarriage ensues, begins with an act of violence perpetrated against a pregnant woman. And yet, this woman is all but absent from subsequent conversations about this passage. Across the centuries, almost all of the voices of Jewish interpretation and even many modern commentators fail to acknowledge her story. The interpreters miss the opportunity to see her as a subject rather than object, to see the woman in this text as merely a hypothetical in a legal case study is to deny that cases such as these were very real to the people who experienced them. To reach a full sense of justice in our understanding of abortion, we must pair mishpatim, laws, with sipurim, stories, they say. So that's what I want to do. The next group of sources is all looking at stories from Jews who have terminated pregnancies in I'd say recently, but they're not all very recent. So I want to look at some of those stories to see how are Jews understanding their abortions? What are some of the nuances here? What are some of the complexities here that we're seeing? I'm starting, and we could start with any one of these sources. I'm starting with Jody Rudorin, who is editor-in-chief of The Forward, I believe, and she recently published this piece in the fall about the 2 terminations that she's had over the course of her lifetime. And this one is a story of fetal diagnosis, one where she received a diagnosis that the fetus she was carrying was going to be extremely disabled. And she decided that she and her spouse were not prepared to raise that child. So the scan had found our fetus had club feet and what is known as a lemon sign on the brain. Neural tube defects are one of the things the spina bifida test is supposed to uncover. Turns out there are a decent number of false negatives. If we continued with the pregnancy, they said, the baby's physical limitations could range from just those club feet to a lifetime in a wheelchair. We could be looking at anything from maybe graduating high school to profound cognitive disabilities. And we had to decide quickly. I was approaching the threshold for fetal viability when abortion is outlawed or prohibited in many states. And I think this is really important because those timelines that you might see, whether it's for 40 days, it's mere water, or in the Jewish sources, or the laws that are being established and are in place in many states, how difficult it is to get an abortion in the third trimester, when fetal diagnosis often is not clear until very late in the pregnancy, means that these decisions are often forced to be rushed at a time when the information is not completely clear. And that, I think, is really a powerful thing that we can get out of this story. So they try to gather as much information as they can. We knew instantly, though, that we are not those people. We were not the people who could raise a profoundly disabled child. They knew that about themselves. Okay. Then Jody Rudorin opens it up, and she says, if you're Jewish and you've had an abortion, tell me about it. Write into us. We will publish your story or an excerpt of your story. And so I've selected just a couple here that I think are illustrative of a few different things. So the first is this one from Adrienne Singer. So she writes, it was 1977. I was 41 years old and a single woman with two elderly and challenged parents who would never physically or monetarily have been able to offer me any type of help. I had no living sisters or brothers. I worked paycheck to paycheck. The gentleman who impregnated me lived on another continent. I met him while touring Asia. We spent a lot of time together as tourists, and on the last evening I had with him, I was stricken with sadness to have to say goodbye. It resulted in a romantic evening. The next day I was on my way back to the US. She discovers she's pregnant. She heads to an abortion clinic. And what's important to highlight about this story is that the reason she's having an abortion is it's not the right time. It's not the right relationship. She doesn't have the funds to raise a child. None of these reasons are within those reasons that our Jewish sources, the ones that are used most prominently, would support an abortion. But then she says in this, I just want to read a couple more lines here to highlight the kind of complexity of this decision. As a pregnant woman, I was in love with this fetus. I loved being pregnant. I felt glowing all over. I would have loved to have had this baby, but my sensible side overpowered me. And I knew I would be in a difficult situation if I didn't work steadily and had to find the money to support my child and manage my life. She says, when the fetus was removed from my body, I felt dead for several days. This depression went on for a few months. So yes, she had this abortion very early for reasons that are not those that are supported by the Jewish texts that claim to be pro-choice. But this is also not one of those taken lightly decisions. She actually feels this decision very heavily, very complexly. And I think that's a very important thing to kind of highlight. Then we have a different story that Rudorin collected from Patricia Bronstein, who said, I had an abortion at age 32. I was married, but had known from high school that I did not want to have a child. Roe was a law by then. It was very early in the pregnancy and it was easy to schedule. I've never been sorry. I still don't have children. So here, another voice from a different source who's telling us that the reason she had an abortion, she just didn't want children. She is, for all intents and purposes, within the conditions that would never have justified an abortion for our Jewish sources. And yet, she doesn't feel she doesn't feel confused about this. She doesn't feel morally vexed about this. She doesn't want children. And that, for our Jewish sources, is not sufficient. Okay. Another kind of example of something similar comes from Sarah Tuttle Singer. This is one of the earliest kind of Jewish abortion confessions that I could find online. Sarah Tuttle Singer is a writer who lives in Jerusalem, and she wrote about her abortion in Kveller in 2012, about being a college student, being a Jewish college student and getting pregnant and not wanting to be pregnant, not ready to have children. And again, she kind of was shocked. She says, nice Jewish girls don't get knocked up freshman year of college. This is the idea that she had. She was terribly embarrassed. She thought there was no support for her within the Jewish community. And interestingly, what she found out actually was that there was a great deal of support within the Jewish community, or at least sufficient philanthropic support for her to follow through on this pregnancy, on this abortion. There was a Jewish women's group that offers a scholarship of $250 to help cover costs. Now that would not even be sufficient at this point, but I guess 10 years ago it must have been. And she asks the doctor at her clinic, how would I qualify? And she says, by being pregnant and by not wanting to be pregnant and by being Jewish, she replied. That's all she needed, but she didn't know. And she says at the end, it sounded great. And not because I had found a way to finance my abortion, but because for the first time since I found out I was pregnant, I realized that I wasn't the first, nor would I be the last knocked up, nice Jewish girl. In other words, what she's kind of expressing in a kind of cheeky way, right, is that she thought that she was an anomaly, right? She thought that there just weren't Jewish young women who were getting pregnant and wanting to terminate pregnancies. I think in part because of this language that we have so often used about justifications. And this, right, for Sarah Tuttle Singer being a nice Jewish girl going to college, right, she thought that wouldn't be enough of a reason to terminate a pregnancy, that this wouldn't be a Jewish reason to terminate a pregnancy. Okay. Our next set of sources is going to highlight a different kind of an additional experience. And I'm going to skip some of this, but this one is from an article by Steph Harold titled What It's Like to Be a Jew of Color and an Abortion Activist in the Trump Era. So this is going to give us two experiences from Jews of color who have abortions. And I'm just going to read the one from Anise Simon. So Anise Simon talked about her abortion with someone at a mikveh in Los Angeles. The attendant asked her what she was hoping to get out of her ritual bath experience, and her story came bubbling out. I unloaded that I'd been in an abusive relationship and I was struggling with it, but I'd been in a place where I'd come to find joy and searching for answers, she told me. She remembers the mikveh attendant recounting stories of strong women in Jewish history, including stories of dysfunctional families and religious mythology. And then I'm just going to skip down to the bottom. She talks also about Candace Russell finding support within her Jewish community, but she writes at the end, both women contextualize their abortions as parenting decisions, deeply rooted in their identities as Jews and people of color. Simon shared, as someone with generational trauma connected to colonialism, the Holocaust, and slavery, I want to do as much as I can to give my children, who will be very much wanted, a safe home that is violence-free. Now, I think, again, this is really important because this is a voice that we really don't have in that first page of sources. These are people who are already parents. The majority of abortions performed in this country are among women who are already parents. They know exactly what they are deciding not to have, right? They know exactly the weight of this decision. They just don't want another child. They are trying to be really conscious and really intentional about the kind of circumstances under which they have children. And that's part of this decision also. And again, I feel like I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but not one of the justifications that is currently within the canon of abortion sources. Okay, next, this one comes up really all the time when I talk about abortion with different Jewish groups. Excuse me for 1 second. Avital Chizik Goldschmidt is a journalist. She worked for the Forward for many years. I forget where she works now. Another publication that's not a Jewish publication, but she is Orthodox herself, and she collected stories anonymously from Orthodox Jews who had terminated pregnancies And some of these stories are also revealing the shame that they experienced, the way in which they could not admit to their abortions. They couldn't come clean with their abortions. So this first one is of prenatal diagnosis. You have somebody who discovered that our baby had trisomy 13 and numerous deformities. They went to a rabbi who agreed that they should terminate the pregnancy to save both mother and child from suffering. So this is some of that kind of mental, emotional suffering that's often referenced. But she says, delivering the baby was another hell. My rabbi came and took the baby, had it prepared and buried. I went home to deal with lying to everyone that I'd had a miscarriage. Even though I know I did everything right, asked all the right professionals, I knew people would be aghast, and so I kept my secret. I think we have to kind of ask ourselves, right? If the sources are so supportive of abortion in this circumstance, why are people still feeling such utter shame and the need to be so secretive around abortions? And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the sources are not really pro-choice. Okay. This is a story of, the next one is source 17, a young woman who was 24 years old. She was 8 weeks pregnant with her first pregnancy. She was in an abusive relationship, and her husband forced her to get an abortion and left her alone afterwards. I felt isolated after that in my community. I was ashamed of my secret of the abortion, of not talking to my rab. So she didn't speak to her rabbi in this circumstance. She finally got out of that relationship. And she writes this: while halachically, according to Jewish law, abortion is complicated. Abortion is complicated. The taboo of talking about it is dangerous. If you have chosen or have been forced to have an abortion, you should not be ashamed into keeping silent for fear of being judged and disowned. We must teach women and men that in this situation, the rabbi should not and will not treat you badly. They will guide you. Do not be afraid of seeking rabbinic counsel. I worry that even in these circumstances, right, an individual might not know that her rabbi is supportive of abortion, because it is not clearly, I mean, I think it is in the case of maternal health, but it is not, right, one of those situations where the pregnancy itself is endangering her life, which is the justification that's set up for us. Then we have a couple of examples from some liberal female rabbis. Rabbi Rachel Pass, who writes that her abortion was a blessing, and this was published in just last year. She writes, I took my pregnancy test on Rosh Chodesh Cheshvan and whispered the blessing, Asher Yatzar et Ha'adam b'Chochmah, who created human beings with wisdom, when it read positive. She attended a required class Shabbat program at Romemu on the Upper West Side. Morning sickness, I prayed. I read every piece of Jewish literature on abortion that I could find. I want to highlight here, ultimately, I made the choice using the instinctual wisdom inside myself, heeding nobody's opinion but my own, and perhaps God's. So here, and Rabbi Pass makes this decision because she's simply not ready to have children. She is in rabbinical school at the time, and she knew that there wouldn't be, perhaps she knew that there wouldn't be rabbinic justification for her abortion, but she made the choice using her own instinctual wisdom. And I just love this kind of rereading that I've seen in various kind of new rituals around pregnancy termination. We Jews are commanded in lines that appear in this week's Torah portion. I have put before you today blessing and curse, life and death. Uvacharta v'chaim, choose life. And many abortion rituals will talk about this line and say, I did choose life. I chose my own life, right? Instead of the life of the fetus. Okay. And finally is Rabbi Jacqueline Cohen, who writes in this article, I'm a rabbi and a mom. She was trying for her second child. got pregnant and discovered that there were going to be severe fetal disabilities. And she realized on her 36th birthday that she needed to go through with the termination. And again, here we see too. And so I chose life, my son's and my husband's lives, our family's collective life. Again, this kind of realization that this is not a light decision. This is made by people who know what they are deciding. I took the science being offered me and I listened, as painful as it was and as heartbroken as I felt. I listened. I recalled my own education from adolescence up through rabbinical school on Judaism's nuanced approach to abortion. In the Mishnah, our post-biblical pre-Talmudic sacred text, we read, if a woman is in hard labor that threatens her life, this is the Mishnah Oholot source, her life takes precedence over its life. In other words, the health and well-being of the mother is of utmost importance, even through childbirth. She insists Jewish tradition honors a woman's right to choose. Okay. So, and this is just a reminder of the initial resolution that Women's League tried to pass about freedom of choice inherent in the civil rights of women. And the leaders say absolutely not, they actually don't. And yet what we see in all of these sources is that actually that is what's informing their decision to terminate their pregnancies. So I'm gonna stop sharing. We have just under 10 minutes for some questions, discussion, right, Lynn?
Yes,
Yeah?
yes,
Great.
we have
Okay.
just under 10 minutes and I have a few questions that have come in.
Super.
So, okay. The first few came in just after the first half and sort of while you were teaching in the second half. So one person suggests a comparison of amputating a limb where if a person's health is in danger due to a limb that requires to be amputated, one would go ahead with that. Why is this reasoning not applied in the case of abortion?
Are you talking about the canonical sources, in other words? So some of the canonical, yes, do you think so?
The question came in just after the first half
Okay.
of the program, yeah. So
there are some rabbinic sources that do talk about the fetus as considered like a thigh of its mother, and therefore that it is hers to decide what to do with. And that is an opinion. It has not, though, and this is something complicated that happens with sources, it has not gotten as much traction in contemporary discourse on abortion rights as other sources. In other words, if that source perhaps were pushed to the forefront and not Maimonides, then maybe we would have a different, we wouldn't have a justification framework. The problem is that Maimonides has been pushed to the forefront of the canon on Jews and abortion. And so we end up with the justification system. But I'll point out that even Elliot Dorff does refer to that source in the piece that I excerpted of his writings. He refers to the idea that a fetus is considered like a limb of its mother, but even then, in order to sever the limb, there needs to be a kind of good enough reason. You can't just decide to walk in and cut off your arm. Your arm has to be somehow hurting the rest of your body. So I'd suggest that even that source is not going to get us out of the justification framework.
okay. One question that I think is very quick. Who was the Orthodox rabbi who permitted abortion in the case of an adulterous relationship?
Oh, it was in the 17th century. I'm blanking on the name right now. I'm sorry.
We'll
say
see if we can.
COVID frog, but 17. I'll look. I actually have some other sources here. I'll see if I can find it.
Okay, I will ask another question in the meantime. And this is the last question that came in just at the very end of the first half of the program. Does violence include rape and incest, or does Judaism not address rape and incest in Jewish life?
Yeah, it's a great, does violence include rape and incest? well, violence, like the violence in I'm not sure violence is really a consideration in the sources at all. Violence leading to the pregnancy or violence during the pregnancy. I don't see that as a prominent voice within the sources. In other words, there isn't a whole lot of talk of rape and incest in the sources. I think because of some of the complicated categories around sex and minors for the rabbis. But it was, I found the source, it was Rabbi Jacob Emden in the 18th century, who considered an adulterous woman shame. But yeah, rape and incest do not come up a lot. But rape and incest also do not account for a large portion of abortions in this country. We're still talking about, you know, all the prenatal health, rape, incest, and maternal health account for about 20 to 25% of abortions in this country. So you've still got a vast majority of the abortions that are not even going to satisfy those justifications.
Thank you for answering these questions. We have a couple more. What do you think has to happen to make the sources truly pro-choice?
Yeah, this is really complicated. So I think you will have a hard time relying on biblical and rabbinic sources for a pro-choice perspective. And that's because a pro-choice perspective relies on the idea of bodily autonomy, the idea that an individual has autonomy over what happens to their body. This is not an idea that the rabbis supported. You know, the idea of being obligated by Jewish law is precisely that you don't have, you know, kind of autonomy over your body, that you are obligated. Your body is obligated in any number of ways. There are so many mitzvot, so many commandments that rely on you doing certain things with your body. So I think we'll be really hard pressed to find the idea of bodily autonomy in our Jewish sources. I recently argued this in an op-ed that I published. I could share that in the chat too. Maybe Lynn, if you have a chance to search for it, it's in JTA. And the Orthodox rabbis agree with me on this. They're just, I think it would be really hard. I mean, I think we could find, and there have been. So the Religious Action Center argues based on, I think, the idea of kavod habriut, that, you know, dignity of human life, that individuals have kind of dignity and rights that are inherent in being human beings. You could look at ubacharta b'chaim. There are any number of kind of values that we could glean from our sources. It just wouldn't be a halachic approach, and I'm okay with that, but a lot of people are not.
Okay, that's an
There is a hand up. Can we take a hand? Is that okay?
Well, there's that
Are there more
person
questions?
has written a question, so I'm going to read that question,
Okay.
and then we'll see whether he wants to elaborate. Do you see a Jewish woman suing in a right-wing no abortion? I'm not sure I'm reading that correctly. For any reason, in a state that is right-wing and has no abortion permitted for any reason, do you see her suing based on religious freedom to live Jewish values, or will the Christian theocracy in Republican states ignore religious freedom in favor of their point of view on abortion?
It's a great question. It is kind of the question of the day. There are some legal scholars who I've heard say that that is what's going to happen next, that you will find religious individuals of many stripes, maybe even some Christians, because actually the majority of Christians are supportive of abortion, who say this is not, this is a violation of my religious freedom. And actually Jewish groups for the last several decades have been trying to argue the same thing, that these views on fetal life are in violation of their religious freedom, and they are an imposition of freedom. They are an imposition of one religion on theirs. I see it happening. I hope we don't even need to get to that. but there's another op-ed by Rachel Cranson, who's another colleague of mine, Kranson, who has written about this history and why the religious right has actually made this very difficult to follow through. So I'm not convinced of the success of the approach, but it might be the next step.
Okay, well, I want to thank you so much. It is
Thank you all.
7:40, so
I know, we're
we
gonna
will,
close. Yeah.
yes, we are going to return. Whoops, here we are.
I hope that everyone enjoyed their study sessions. We have a 10-minute break now, and our closing panel will begin at 7:50. And I'm opening the chat during our break, so you can feel free to chat with each other if you'd like.